I don't care how hard business owners and landlords worked for the parameters of extracting their own living from others. Nor do I care about any of the risks they've undertaken. Nor do I care how good any of their ideas were. I'll say it again for those still shocked by me saying it the first time. I don't care. There is one basic reason why, and it starts out entertaining the decidedly silly notion that business owners and landlords do meet these supposedly required criteria. And even assuming that notion is true, it still doesn't lend any weight to capitalism. Billions of individuals around the world work hard in fulfilling their occupational and civic duties, often through pain and misery, throughout their entire lives, many at the peril of illness, injury, and death. And all too often, they end up with nothing to show for their effort or the risks they've taken upon their own lives. Clearly, hard work and risk-taking don't realistically grant anyone else the privilege of deciding how others should live and work, or what forms their economies must take, at a level of discretion begetting them profit. So how can it be, all of a sudden, that these qualities grant that very same privilege to business owners and landlords? Was it the good idea attributable to the capitalist? Maybe. Then again, maybe not. And this is all supposing that the capitalists are indeed the originators of the ideas in question. I've also seen bad ideas and absurd ideas prosper under capitalism. Ever heard of designer drugs? That's one example of this reality. Another example lies in the apparent fact that a celebrity has recently sponsored the development of scented candles designed to take after the odor of her own genitalia. Scented candles which are apparently liable to double possibly as unforeseeable pyrotechnics. Why should a good idea serve to justify prosperity by the exercise of leverage over economic parameters and the economies that rely on such parameters to sustain themselves, when bad ideas prosper and receive such leverage just as freely and easily? And without any meaningful and autonomous access to capital that can back up and realize a good idea, that good idea is as good to its originator and the rest of the world as unthought. So in order for an idea to prove it's worth handing over monopolistic control over the parameters of economy to the originator must be in a position to obtain that control in the first place. Very shaky logic we're working with. And if the idea proposed doesn't turn out to be that great after all, well, then there's always marketing by manipulative advertising. Even though the merit held by the idea couldn't possibly justify handing over leverage to the originator, since it lacks merit. But then the prosperity of the idea, albeit begotten by the caprice of advertising, would suffice. Congratulations, you are now employing circular reasoning to justify capitalism, whereby the idea justifies the outcome, and the outcome justifies the idea, from which we can discern no clear logical terminus. This is because, at its conception, capitalism organizes economic parameters and produces and distributes goods on a basis that is completely irrational. Also, I find it a little strange how people take it for granted that the capacity for having ideas is a characteristic unique to entrepreneurs, that this somehow makes their ideas special. Go ahead, pro-capitalist, clutch your pearls as tightly as it pleases you about hard work, and risk, and good ideas. The facts are plainly self-evident that your pearls are fake, but I think you still might be able to clutch those pearls a little more securely within your sphincter. As far as it concerns me, and the matter at hand is in regards to the structure of our economy and its institutions, so obviously it does concern me, you can't work hard enough, you can't take risks great enough, and you can't have ideas good enough. It is impossible to earn the privilege of deciding on the basis and value of anyone else's livelihood, let alone the conditions of the economy. It is not only impossible, it is factually inconsistent with the world presently in front of us. Thank you for attending, my dear pro-capitalist friends. In my next lecture, I will be delivering you instructions in the art of sucking eggs.
6 months later!
Recently, I've had a conversation with my mother about the economic conditions of the enterprises where I've worked, and about the correlation between wages offered at the enterprises and the number of employees working therein. And as I'm writing, I remember that I had a converse but corroborating iteration of that exact conversation with her a couple of years ago. And throughout all the jobs I've held, as an anarcho-communist, I've already held an intermediate grasp of liberal economics, which is to say, the economic theories and practices under which capitalism operates at its optimum capacity. And even at the optimum capacity, the trajectory at which the mean rate of profit for capitalist enterprise continues to fall indicates that capitalism will no longer benefit even the business owner, and will thereafter collapse by the end of the 21st century. And then, upon outliving its utility in the increasingly impossible endeavor of extracting profit, wagedom would have to be abolished, and I would likely still be alive by that time. But back to the matter at hand. Starting off with the first job I've held, I worked at a convenience store at minimum wage in the state of Nevada, and the manager's wages were barely any better than mine, by only a few cents more per hour. Within the first few weeks I started working there, I noticed that on a routine basis, there weren't enough employees on site at any given time to fulfill all duties to any given location. I also noticed that some employees, including myself since my services seemed to receive preference on account of my personal work habits, and especially the managers, were frequently working more hours than were officially scheduled, sometimes to even fix mistakes that could only have been made by the upper management. But we all seem to know not to speak of that. And employees who declined to work additional hours were not kept for very long. I also took notice of the fact that store managers were very frequently frustrated more than others by the fact that the stores were understaffed, and that any time they seemed to complain about it to the upper management, they were fired. The enterprise in question was indeed a revolving door, but especially so for managers. That's why I said managers, plural. Also, there were no scheduled breaks. We were told that we could conceivably take breaks at the nearest plausible convenience, which meant that we could take breaks when we completed our regular duties and when there weren't any urgent duties or customers present. So breaks were usually available every 4 to 5 hours, provided they were even available. And they usually lasted 5 to 10 minutes. So in this minimum wage to barely better than minimum wage job, the work sites were frequently understaffed and the suitable employees worked more hours than scheduled. My educated guess at the reason for this was because the upper management must have known it would be cheaper at the minimum wage at the time to have fewer employees than were actually essential to operate, working overtime, hoping to find just the right combination of very few employees, than to have exactly the number of employees needed working no more than the hours required of them. I also guessed that if the wages were raised up to a critical point, the upper management might then find it cheaper to have no fewer than the essential number of employees, working no more than the hours they were to be scheduled. This is because overtime can only be attributable to oversights by upper management, and as such, employees must legally be compensated for overtime by at least time and a half. They must have known that it would be cheaper for them to experiment with how many oversights they could make in the hours they schedule for very few employees, plus a relatively consistent number of hours of time and a half at the lowest base wage they could get away with paying. But I guessed that if that base wage were raised by even $1 per hour, they would no longer be able to afford undergoing bets and experimentation with time and a half, and they would have to have more employees for the stores to operate at optimum capacity, as that would then become the cheaper option. Now I'm in industry working full-time. This enterprise where I currently work seems to value regularity in hours worked very highly. The work culture there seems to be that you should work exactly the hours you're scheduled, and that you should take breaks exactly when you are scheduled to do so. So how are the wages? The lowest wage this enterprise is willing to offer is higher than the state minimum wage by $4 at least. And as I currently know it, this enterprise indicated that it had up until recently been struggling to get exactly the number of employees they need, working exactly the number of hours they are to be scheduled. And I am willing to bet that they are not willing to play with the idea of anyone working more hours than are required of them, even on the presumably rare occasion that overtime is required, as that might pose a liability to their revenue at the wages offered. And the funny thing about this, I'm still not in any skilled position. So, my initial assessment about the relationship between wages offered and workers employed was correct. The lower the wages, the more willing employers will be to hire fewer employees than needed, working more hours than needed. The higher the wages, the less willing employers will be to operate under such parameters. Rather, they will be more willing to have no less than the employees needed, working no more than the hours needed. This is also leading me to suspect that enterprises that offer such higher wages to more employees and operate under such parameters befitting of higher wages to more employees are more likely to operate at an optimum capacity on a regular basis. This, dear pro-capitalists, was the lecture hitherto promised on how to suck eggs. Please share it with your grandmother. Fuck you, Facebook.